So, the war. It's probably the biggest plot point in Enstars, shaping the lives and developments of many of the older members of the cast. As such, there tends to be a lot of discussion surrounding it. Fans may read the stories, watch the reminiscence animations, or the 2 war documentaries by mediocre Enstars YouTuber Selena Attempts, and they may find that their opinions on the characters involved have started to change based on what they have consumed. Some fans, after reading Marionette for the first time, may pause, turn around to face their adorable little Eichi Nui and go, "What you did back there was pure evil. I still love you anyway, you silly little guy." One thing that is for certain is that if your favourite character was involved in the war, you're gonna want to defend them until your last breath. Depending on your fave, you're most likely either going to be Team Eccentrics or Team Vine, and that will probably impact how you see the events in the war. Honestly, it's kinda like Fire Emblem Three Houses. When you have characters that are in clear factions, whichever faction your favourite character is in is gonna impact how you view the opposite one. And why I find myself sobbing whenever I remember that Dimitri dies in every route that isn't his, and doesn't even get an animated cutscene dedicated to such deaths. Anyway, back to Enstars. Within the factions in the war, X-Fine are the most antagonistic group, both in the fandom and with how the characters themselves view them. Out of the antagonized faction of X-Fine featuring AKATSUKI, there is one character who always gets slandered in terms of always being given the blame for the war. That character, as we all know, is Eichi. However, is it really fair to say that he deserves all the blame for the events of the war? Yes. Is it though? What about the other 3 members of X-Fine? What about Akatsuki? Are they at fault? Do the 5 Eccentrics, as tragic as they are, deserve a portion of the blame as well? That's what I want to know as well, so I'm going to talk about it, here and now. Eichi isn't even my favourite character. Who that title goes should be fairly obvious to you by now. But he's interesting, and the war is just really nice for content. So, was the Yumenosaki War really all Eichi's fault? So, the first big thing that I'd say marks the start of the war is Checkmate, where Knight subjugates the other offshoot units of chess. By default, since no other units turned up to the match. The whole breaking up of chess happened because Eichi introduced the rule that units needed 2 to 5 members, and chess had a lot more than 5, so they needed to split. And, to see which offshoot was the best, Checkmates was established. But Leo didn't exactly want to fight all of his friends from chess and honestly kind of doubted their friendship, so he told them that they could either be his friend or use his songs, since he composed at least a good chunk of their songs. Naturally, like the good friends that they were, they chose his songs. What happens next is pretty well known, with Leo becoming depressed and taking a long break from his idol activities. Eichi gets a lot of blame for this, and he also asks himself if Leo's mental collapse was actually his fault. And I'm gonna say, not entirely. Let's do a bit of analysis. Woohoo! So, the first thing to note is that Eichi used the minimum/maximum unit members rule in order to target the 5 Eccentrics, forcing them to form a unit with friends that they most likely did not have in order to continue being Yumenosaki idols. This was premeditated, no doubt about it. It also worked the other way around, with massive units of allies and friends also being forced to break up and causing rifts in relationships. So, it's safe to assume that Eichi fully knew that this rule was going to negatively impact Leo. He said it himself, since Leo was the test to see if his plans to reform the school would actually work, kind of like a beta test eccentric. So he does deserve the blame for that. However, Eichi's whole shtick during the war is that friendships are purely transactional. You only become friends with someone because you want something from them, such as money, or in Leo's case, their songs. This is honestly a pretty philosophical topic, I can't lie, with the answer being different depending on who you ask. The answer to the question, is Eichi's view on friendship right? Obviously, during the war, Eichi thinks that he is right. So with this in mind, I don't think that he planned for Leo to go through all of that. He might have just assumed that Leo was also in this whole transactional friendship thing, and once chess broke up, he'd just move on and go about the rest of his day with knights. Although, he did have a bit of a villainous monologue at the end of Checkmate saying that it was his plan, but it's not like he was the one that forced the chess NPCs to drop Leo as a friend. Honestly, the one who kind of put the final nail in the coffin was Leo. Well, he was the one who suspected that the NPCs were fake, But he was also the one who gave him that ultimatum that ultimately dealt him that final friendless blow. If he hadn't said "it's me or the songs," then there may have been a compromise, and the impact left on him by Checkmate may not have been as severe. In addition, even though the chess NPCs validated Eichi's views on friendship, they could have proved him wrong. Just because I say that all my friends are fake and they only want me around for my money, it doesn't mean that it's true. The fault on this falls on the chess NPCs for being fake friends. If they weren't fake, then Eichi would have been proved wrong, Leo would be mentally stable, and the past 900 words would have never been written. In reality, Eichi's new rule did have an impact on Leo's life falling apart, but I'd say that he didn't actually do too much. He had a plan, but plans don't always work. If the chess NPCs were proper friends and Leo didn't decide to issue that ultimatum, then things might not have been as bad. All in all, I think it's unfair to say that Leo's downfall was entirely Eichi's fault. The next thing that happens is the big shift in public opinion of the 5 Eccentrics. To be more specific, Eichi invited them to a joint live with Fine, which they all ghosted, except for Rei, who only declined because the others did. Now, did the 5 Eccentrics know that ghosting this invitation would make them the enemies of the entire student population? Of course not. But it would have been nice of them to show up, or at least politely decline with some wishy-washy excuse. Here's why. At this point in time, people actually kinda liked the Eccentrics. They were seen as talented and respectable, and people looked up to them. Wataru was this theatrical master of all talents, Kanata was this mystical religious figurehead, Shu was the top idol in Yumenosaki, and Rei was a very popular student council president. Natsume was a new first year, so he wasn't as popular as the others, but he probably had a little cult following due to his fortune telling. Since they were well liked, some of them could have at least considered that ghosting a seemingly innocent invitation was going to reflect negatively onto them. Actually, I just don't think they cared, but still, them not showing up proved the point that Eichi was trying to make, that the Eccentrics held everyone else in contempt. If they did show up, their reputations might have increased. I mean, Eichi did predict that none of them would show up, and he was betting on that, but he could have been wrong. To conclude this little segment, the start of the fall of the Eccentrics is the fault of the Eccentrics. Shu's execution is up next, and there goes half of my subscribers. Hear me out, put your pitchforks away. Yes, I do believe that Eichi absolutely caused the music to be cut off, probably through bribery, and that was very mean of him to do. However, absolutely no one knew that Valkyrie was lip-syncing. Anyone who claims that they did know just had an accurate guess. I mean, come on, they were either lip-syncing or they weren't. It's a simple 50-50 chance. Did Eichi know? No, he was predicting it, just like with most of the things he gets blamed for. It just so happens that he accurately predicted most of the events in the war, including Valkyrie lip-syncing. So, whose fault was Shu's downfall? Shu. Why? Because he was the one who made everyone lip-sync. I mean, come on, people were going to find out eventually. It was only becoming more and more obvious, with Nazuna belting out songs outside in a voice that sounded very different to the one he uses in performances, and Valkyrie always performed the same songs in the exact same way and refused to put out any new songs. People were going to find out sooner or later. It was just a matter of when. And, as things would have it, they would find out during the live against Fine. Here's the thing, if they weren't lip-syncing but Eichi suspected that they were, paid someone to cut off their music, and it turned out that they actually were singing live, the audience would have been thrilled, with Valkyrie most likely absolutely devouring an a cappella performance, once again proving that they deserve the title of Yumenosaki's top unit. However, they were lip-syncing, and they were exposed to be the talentless cheats that Eichi wanted everyone to believe they were. The man even says it himself, saying, "Thank you for playing the way I thought you would," to Shu as ex-Fine went on stage. He thought that Valkyrie were lip-syncing, tested out his theory, and it turned out that his theory was correct. So, apologies Valkyrie Ps, but you're gonna have to take the L on this one. As I've mentioned before, many things that Eichi planned out simply depended on chance. I think that he's often portrayed to be this malicious schemer, which, I mean, he does scheme maliciously, but he's not entirely this genius scheming mastermind. With the events that I've just mentioned, Eichi's plans entirely depended on the actions of the other parties involved. Or to be more specific, they depended on those parties acting in the way that Eichi thought they would. He never really knew for sure that those events would turn out the way they did. He just assumed that they would, based on his observations of the people around him, and also his slightly skewed view on life. Most of these things, like with Shu's execution, all go the same way. Eichi assumes that something is the case, he makes a plan to see if his assumptions are correct, and it just so happens that they were the case after all. Honestly, he's not really an ultra scheming mega genius, he's just good at predicting things and has good observational skills. Though there are times when his assumptions were proven to be false. Case in point, ex fine. Again, as I've mentioned before, Eichi believed that friendship is purely transactional. Anyone that wanted to befriend him was only in it for the money. As such, he formed contracts with ex fine with this view in mind. They may get along well during their time in the unit called Fine, but once their work is done and everyone got what they wanted, they would all separate and go on about their day. For example, he assumed that Tsumugi was only in it for the money that he would get to pay off his family's debts. Likewise, on Eichi's side, he would become friends with the other members of Ex Fine because he needed them to help him defeat the Eccentrics. However, as we know, Eichi's assumptions about the other members of Ex Fine, especially Tsumugi, were proven to be false. Tsumugi genuinely wanted to be Eichi's friend because he liked him as a person, and I'd assume that Nagisa and maybe Hiyori may have also shared the same sentiment if things played out a little differently. This just resulted in everyone's feelings being hurt and the group barely being able to hold themselves together during their final performance. Ultimately, this didn't really have an impact on the outcome of the war because this all happened far too late for it to actually change anything. Unless Wataru decided to go along with Natsume's script, which I will talk about soon. Really, if Tsumugi had brought up the clause concerning Ex Fine disbanding earlier on in the war, Ex Fine may not have been as successful as they were. However, he brought it up when the war was basically over, so even though Eichi's assumptions of Tsumugi were proven to be false, it was far too late to actually change anything. So, with that in mind, the other times where Eichi relied on the probability of his assumptions being correct could have severely altered the course of the war. And had he been proven wrong, checkmate may not have happened, the Eccentrics may have still been very popular, and Valkyrie would have been even more formidable than they already were. But let's not assume that Eichi shouldn't be blamed for anything. That's not true. He's done some pretty nasty things that were entirely premeditated and thoroughly thought out. For example, he sent Madara overseas and basically limited his internet access so that he couldn't step in to help Kanata. Most of what happened to Kanata was basically all thoroughly planned, so he didn't really rely on chance for that one. But he didn't do it on his own. Actually, Eichi had a lot of help during the war, and some other characters should probably have the spotlight put on them when it comes to talking about certain things that have happened. Let's start with what I've just mentioned, Kanata's execution. With this one, Ex Fine didn't really have as big of a role as they did in the other executions. The main perpetrators here were AKATSUKI, or more specifically, Kaito. You see, Kaito was the one who came up with the whole idea of the 3 eccentrics, which Eichi changed to the 5 eccentrics because he preferred the number 5 or something. The first big crime against Kanata that was committed was when the student council basically exposed him for being a fraud. They crafted this whole media propaganda smear campaign to basically say that the student council were the ones who granted all the wishes in Yumenosaki, and the sheep in the student population all believed them. So Kaito and Eichi have a joint role here, but I think that Kaito had more of a role with this one. However, let's not forget about the other 2 members of Akatsuki, Kuro and Soma. You see, Akatsuki's role in the war was to do Fine's dirty work for them. In this case, it would be getting rid of Kanata, since Kanata was a very powerful and revered religious figure. Fine going after Kanata would have tarnished their pristine reputation as underdogs bringing hope, leading the charge against the wicked eccentrics. So Akatsuki had to do it for them. Did Kuro and Soma know what they were signing up for when joining Kaito and Akatsuki? Yes, they did. In fact, Kaito even tried to convince them against getting involved, through simply asking Kuro if he knew what he was getting involved in, and full-on verbally abusing Soma so that he would scare him away from joining him. Regardless, they both joined anyway. Kuro said that he owned Kaito for helping Chiaki earlier, and Soma just kinda told Kaito that he shouldn't be shocked over something that he clearly caused, and to just get on with it, leading to him being invited to join AKATSUKI. Soma's whole situation just kinda proves how some characters get overlooked in what they did during the war, because he knew that Kaito was actively scheming to bring about Kanata's downfall, and was trying to help Kanata anyway by acting as a double agent, but then he went and joined AKATSUKI when Kanata's downfall was a guarantee. What I'm really trying to say here is that AKATSUKI are just as guilty as Eichi when it comes to the war. The other members of Ex-Fine also deserve a bit of flack for the war. Hiyori and Nagisa could use the defense that they didn't know that they were going to basically cause a witch hunt against the 5 Eccentrics, and I guess they would be right in using that defense. Tsumugi, on the other hand, might struggle with this one. First of all, he helped Eichi pick out the members of the Eccentrics. To be fair to Tsumugi, Eichi just asked him to help pick 5 super talented people, and that's what he did. But all the clues to Eichi's true intentions were right there in front of him. First of all, when Eichi revealed that the group was going to be called the Gokijin, Tsumugi mentioned that the group's name sounds like the cockroaches, which is rather unpleasant, and Eichi never denied that. Though Tsumugi does like to see the best in people and be like, oh, they'd never do something like that. He can't exactly claim that he never knew that Eichi was going to lead a mass bullying campaign against these 5 students. I mean, it's kind of like going, oh, I really love this group of people. They're so nice and talented. Let's give them a name that sounds really similar to a common pest that is seen as filthy and disgusting by the vast majority of people. No shade though. By him knowing that the Eccentrics were given an unpleasant group name, bringing that up with Eichi and basically getting a womp womp response and then never bringing it up again and just going along with the rest of the war, Tsumugi had basically accepted that that's what he and Eichi are gonna do, and he's gonna go along with it because Eichi's his friend. Later on, Natsume even confronts him about just going along with Eichi's plans, even though he can see that it's hurting the Eccentrics, like, really badly, and that they didn't really do anything to deserve being bullied, and Tsumugi's just kinda like, okay, but Eichi's doing a good thing, so you have to put up with it. In conclusion, Tsumugi was definitely Eichi's biggest enabler in the war. Not to say that Eichi has no fault in this, the guy knew exactly what he was doing. But Tsumugi also knew what he was doing and just stuck with it. So, really, he also deserves a fair bit of the blame. Back to Nagisa and Hiyori, and they shouldn't get as much of the blame as Tsumugi, but I don't think that they should get off scot-free. I do think it's true that they didn't know what they were actually getting into. They just knew that they were joining a unit and were going to try and lead the revolution. I mean, Hiyori technically joined and then Nagisa joined because Hiyori joined. It's kind of like when you turn to your best friend and go, I'll join if you join. Still, I suppose they did eventually find out what was truly going on and also stuck with it. I think that out of everyone, these two were the most negatively affected out of the Fine faction. Though I guess they could have left if they felt that bad about what they were doing. But they were also bound by contract, so depending on the terms of the contract, which we don't know, they could have been trapped. Legally, even, if Eichi really went all out on those contracts. So I think that Nagisa and Hiyori aren't as guilty as Tsumugi, but at the end of the day, they still went along with it. Though what separates these two from Tsumugi is that Eichi's intentions were made clear before Tsumugi signed any contracts, whilst Nagisa and Hiyori didn't know. Really, Tsumugi was the only one who knew what he was actually getting into. Except for the disbanding bit, but he really did know about that, he just thought it was a joke. The other two knew about that bit. If you want to be really mean to Nagisa and Hiyori and be like, well, you guys are rich, you could have afforded lawyers to get you out of the contract, then I can see where you're coming from, but that wouldn't really change much, since their guilt is only due to them being members of Fine. Though their presence still allowed Eichi to do his whole thing, still enabling him. However, there is another party who isn't really spoken about much when it comes to the war. Ritsu. Ritsu was the one who helped Eichi take down Rei by sending him overseas. Though Eichi was ultimately the big mastermind behind it all, causing all the problems in those sister schools, Ritsu still helped him figure it all out, so he deserves some of the blame for it as well. Lastly, some of the eccentrics hold some of the blame as well. I've already talked about Shu with his insistence on Valkyrie lip-syncing being the thing that ultimately led to his downfall. I, unfortunately, have to give my bias some of the blame, kind of for the same reason as Shu. Wataru, unfortunately, also falls victim to the acting how Eichi assumes they would trope, in that Eichi believed that Wataru would identify a script in Eichi's revolution, realise he's meant to play a villain, and then go down without a fight because that was his role in the story, and a good actor always finds a way to make a script work. Wataru, being an actor at heart, did exactly that, even encouraging everyone else to act accordingly to the roles given to them. The funny thing about this is that he could have changed the outcome of the war if he really wanted to. Eichi predicted that he wouldn't want to, but he was probably still stressing over the possibility that he would pull an Uno reverse card and launch an attack on Fine instead. This is why Natsume's script was significant. It might have changed the outcome of the war, but Wataru decided that ganging up on Fine would have made everything worse by prolonging the conflict, so he chose not to follow it. He could have stopped his own execution, but he chose not to. So really, it wasn't Eichi who caused Wataru's downfall, it was Wataru. But I guess he didn't really have a choice, as following the script and possibly prolonging the war would have made the eccentrics look worse than they already did, so he had to sacrifice himself to end the war and make everyone happy again. It's depressing, but it's still kinda on him. The same thing can be said about Rei to a certain extent, since he also had the same stance as Wataru in that prolonging the war would make it worse for everyone. But I can still make an argument against him because no one is safe in this script, except for Chiaki, who has done no wrong in the war and was genuinely just trying to help people. But back to Rei, and can I just remind you that he was the student council president before Eichi. So, he could have tried to improve Yumenosaki since he did have a lot of power and influence in the school. I mean, everyone liked the guy. Except for Ritsu, but this ain't about him. Rei was also asked by Kaito to help him reform Yumenosaki before the war even broke out, and Rei refused. I mean, he was on the verge of crashing out and had his own reasons for not wanting to, but he had the opportunity to get a hold of things before someone more, ambitious could. Rei was frequently overseas trying to find a cure for his family's vampire illness, but he still had duties as a student council president, and unfortunately for basically everyone, he failed to act. Whoops. His whole thing was kinda just, oh, I know I could do something about it, but why should I? I dunno, man, maybe because you're the student council president. So that gave Eichi the ability to come in and be like, well, if he's not going to do anything, then I will. Take his position as the new president and, well, we all know what happens next. Future Selena here, and I'm just going to jump in here real quick to say that Kanata and Natsume were, in my opinion, the only eccentrics that were properly victimised by the pro-Fine faction. This is because Kanata was generally not as aware of everything that was happening around him as much as the other four, since he was still being effectively brainwashed by the Shinkai cult, and some of the people around him were trying to downplay how serious the situation was to him. For example, Soma just put it down to, oh, they don't understand our ways. I believe Kanata was quite sheltered and just didn't realise what was actually happening to him until it was too late. Natsume did fully understand what was happening, but unlike his seniors, I believe that even if he did launch a resistance in favour of the eccentrics, he simply lacked the power and influence for it to actually be successful. He was the youngest of the eccentrics, and most likely also the weakest, so he simply couldn't do anything to change the situation once the war had properly started. On the other hand, the other three just didn't really help themselves. I know it's controversial, but I thoroughly believe that Shu's downfall was entirely of his own doing, since, again, you can only secretly lip-sync for so long before people get suspicious. Wataru basically took his role as an actor to heart, and embraced the role of the villain that the pro-Fine faction wanted him to be. As for Rei, I think that there is a general consensus that he could have done something to avoid the war, or at least change the tide of it, but he just chose not to act because he simply didn't want to. These three were absolutely aware of the situation that they were getting themselves into, but simply refused to make changes and adapt to the situation, therefore putting the cause of their own downfalls down to their own inaction. To conclude this lengthy discussion that arguably took more time and effort than my 2 pieces of law coursework I had to do last month, I believe that my client, Mr. Eichi Tenshouin, is not entirely to blame for the events of the Yumenosaki War. Though he did conspire behind the scenes and honestly quite publicly at the same time to lead a mass bullying campaign against 5 teenagers, the blame is not solely on him. To summarise, here are the accused and their crimes. Kato Hasumi, for being Eichi's right-hand man and also organising things behind the scenes. Remember, he was the one that came up with the idea of the 3 eccentrics, not my client. Also for what happened to Kanata. Kuro Kiryu and Soma Kanzaki for actively taking part in the subjugation of Kanata Shinkai and openly assisting Kato in his schemes, with prior knowledge of what the impact would be. Tsumugi Aoba for enabling Eichi's schemes with full knowledge of what was going to happen. Hiyori, Tomoe and Nagisa ran, to a lesser extent, but they also just went along with everything, so collective guilt I guess. Ritsu Sakuma for conspiring with Eichi to sabotage Rei. Shu Itsuki for causing his own downfall. Wataru Hibiki and Rei Sakuma for their inaction and assisting in their own downfalls. Kanata Shinkai, Natsume Sakazaki and the other 3 eccentrics for ghosting Fine's invitation. This is kinda petty, but things could have been different if they accepted it. Leo Tsukinaga for issuing the ultimatum that caused his own downfall. And the chess NPCs for being fake friends. Not to say that Eichi isn't guilty, he absolutely is. But it's on these guys as well. The only innocent people here are the characters that just didn't really do a whole lot. Chiaki Morisawa and Madara Mikajima were genuinely just trying to help, but they simply lacked the power to do anything. Madara was shipped overseas and physically couldn't contact anyone, and no one really cared about Chiaki, so he was just doing the best he could with what he had, and did stand up to bullying. Nazuna Nito and Mika Kagehira were forced to do whatever Shu told them to. At the end of the day, the only person Shu really sabotaged was himself, as the other 2 can just argue that Shu was a nasty control freak and stop them from being the idols they wanted to be. Izumi Sena and Arashi Narukami were kinda just there, like they didn't really do anything except taking part in Checkmate. Koga Ogami, Kaoru Hakaze and Adonis Otagari were also just kinda there. Koga just wanted to vibe with his new guitar, Kaoru had a live house to pretend to run, and Adonis had literally just arrived in the country. Trickstar were also just vibing. Mao Isara was part of the student council, but he didn't take part in any scheming or the war itself. The most he did was issue pieces of paper from student council higher-ups to leaders of flopping clubs. He was just the messenger. So, in a nutshell, Eichi didn't do that much. He just accurately predicted a lot of stuff, that therefore allowed him to move forward with his agenda, and he was surrounded by multiple co-conspirators and enablers, so all those people are also guilty. Truthfully, the people we should really be blaming here are the faculty of Yumenosaki Private Academy, because where the f*** were the adults? Case closed. Well, that was a lot. Please don't take this too seriously, it's just for fun. Anyway, if this video was mediocre enough for you, then please remember to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and I'll see you next time. Bye!